The night had long passed its peak, and the air was thick with silence, almost suffocating. A convoy of armored SUVs moved stealthily along a rugged road, weaving through the barren fields of rural Texas. Headlights cut through the darkness, casting fleeting shadows of skeletal trees and dilapidated houses. Inside the vehicles, there were no urgent phone calls, no high-stakes meetings. No reporters, no media coverage. Just a quiet journey, an unannounced visit. At the end of the road, a homeless veterans' shelter emerged from the shadows, as silent and forgotten as the men living inside it. This was not a state-of-the-art military hospital with gleaming hallways and dedicated medical staff. It was merely a makeshift facility, its walls stained with the passage of time, its creaky beds groaning under the weight of restless bodies turning in their sleep. Here resided the men who had once worn the uniform with pride, who had stood on the front lines, who had fought and bled for their country. Yet when they returned, they were abandoned. The cheering crowds were gone. The firm handshakes, the words of gratitude faded like echoes of a distant past. All that remained were bodies scarred by war, minds eroded by time, and memories that refused to let go. The door of the leading SUV swung open. Donald Trump stepped out, his tall frame illuminated under the pale glow of the moon. He wore a long black coat, his hands tucked casually into his pockets as his eyes scanned the somber surroundings. The cold night air brushed against his face, carrying the faint, acrid scent of smoke from a small fire burning in the distance. There was no entourage of aides hurrying ahead to clear the way, no security detail making a show of his presence. This visit was not on any official schedule. There would be no morning headlines. His steps were measured but resolute, the sound of his shoes striking against the dry, uneven ground echoing into the stillness of the night. In the distance, beneath the flickering firelight, a group of veterans sat huddled, wrapped in tattered blankets, their shoulders hunched against the cold. They did not speak. They only watched. To them, the arrival of a politician was nothing new. They had seen men like him before. Men who came with rehearsed smiles, polished speeches, and hollow handshakes meant more for the cameras than for them. They had long stopped believing. But Trump did not walk toward a podium. He did not summon someone to deliver a speech, nor did he attempt to express sympathy with words carefully chosen for effect. Instead, he walked straight toward the group, pulled up a battered folding chair, and sat down. For a moment, silence reigned. Suspicion still lingered in their tired eyes, but in the hush of the night, only the soft whisper of the wind and the crackling of burning wood remained. Then, an older man, perhaps in his 60s, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, whether from years of smoking or from sleepless nights haunted by memories, no one could tell. "Mr. President, what are you doing here?" Trump met his gaze not with distance, not with pity, but with something else, something real. He replied, his voice low and steady, "Because I needed to be here." No one spoke after that. The firelight flickered, reflected in the weary eyes of men who had once been warriors, who had stared death in the face, only to return and be forgotten by the very nation they had fought to protect. Grant stared at Trump, his aged eyes still sharp with the battle-hardened gaze of a man who had known war all his life. He took a deep breath, as if trying to gauge the weight of the promise he had just heard. Over the years, he had heard too many promises of support, of care, of improving the lives of veterans. But those words had always faded into the void, disappearing like cigarette smoke vanishing into the night. William Grant had once been a seasoned colonel, a soldier who had fought in some of America's most brutal military campaigns. He had spent over 30 years in the armed forces, standing on the front lines, watching his brothers in arms fall, losing the men he had fought beside. But for Grant, the greatest pain did not come from bullets or bombs, it came from the day he received the news that his son, Lieutenant Daniel Grant, had been killed in an ambush in Afghanistan. Daniel had not just been a soldier, he had been his father's pride. A young man full of ideals, believing that he could make a difference in the world. But he was taken too soon, leaving behind a void in Grant's heart that nothing could ever fill. When Daniel fell, the government called him a hero. But to Grant, That title was nothing more than ink on paper. In reality, all he had left was an empty home, his son's old letters, and a soulless medal that meant nothing in the absence of the boy who once wore the uniform with pride. Not long after, Grant left the military, but civilian life did not welcome him back. The system he had served had abandoned him. No one was there to help him cope with his PTSD. No one helped him find a job. No one cared about an aging veteran who was no longer of use. Grant wandered from place to place, homeless, with no future. He survived on the meager resources provided by makeshift veterans' shelters, struggling to find a reason to keep going. Every night he sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, and asked himself, "Does anyone still remember soldiers like me?" Jacob Hayes lowered his head, the firelight casting shadows on his youthful face, a face that had aged beyond its years. "I once thought that fighting for my country was an honor," he said, his voice trembling. "But when I came back, I didn't feel like I belonged anymore. I couldn't get a job. I couldn't fit into civilian life. People looked at me like I was a burden, something they had no use for. Everything I sacrificed, was it for this?" Jacob Hayes had been born into a working-class family in Ohio. He had grown up with a burning dream of serving his country. At 18, he enlisted, becoming part of an elite special forces unit in Iraq. He had been one of the best soldiers in his division, a sharpshooter with unshakable discipline, driven by the same sense of duty as the heroes he had read about in books. But war was nothing like the stories. On a mission to rescue hostages, Jacob's unit fell into a trap. An explosion went off right beside him. When he woke up in a field hospital, his right arm was gone. What followed was an entirely new battle, one that had nothing to do with war. He had to learn how to live again, trapped in a body that no longer felt like his own. But the greatest loss was not his arm, it was the loss of his entire future. When Jacob returned home, he expected support, expected to be received as a soldier who had sacrificed for his country. But reality was far colder. No one wanted to hire a crippled soldier. No one wanted to employ someone who had outlived his usefulness. He lost his job. Then his home. Then his faith in everything. Slowly, Jacob became one of the ghosts haunting the city streets, another forgotten veteran, living off spare change from passing strangers, stripped of everything that had once made him proud. A cold gust of wind swept through the night, making the ember of Grant's cigarette glow faintly in the darkness. He stubbed it out on the ground, his gaze locked onto Trump's face. "You said my son's name would not be forgotten," he repeated, his voice firm and low. "But what about the others? The ones like Jacob? The thousands of veterans out there, wandering without shelter, without hope. Will they be forgotten?" Trump remained silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice steady, unwavering. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can make sure that from this moment forward they are not abandoned again." Grant let out a laugh, not bitter, but tired. It was the laugh of a man who had been disappointed too many times, but who still wanted to believe. "I've heard a lot of promises, Mr. President," he murmured. "I want to see action." Trump nodded, his eyes resolute. "You will." Silence fell over the group, but it was not a silence of doubt or despair. It was a silence of men who had suffered for too long, trying to decide if this time, just this once, things might actually be different. A middle-aged veteran, his hair streaked with grey, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, suddenly spoke up. "My name is Roger Wilson," he rasped. "I was a sergeant. I lost a brother in the war in Fallujah. When I came home, I was diagnosed with severe PTSD. I lost my wife, my family. I ended up on the streets, surviving off the kindness of strangers. And now, I'm here." Trump turned to Roger and gave a slow nod. "I can't undo what you've been through. But tell me, what can I do for you now?" Roger studied Trump for a long moment before replying. "We don't need pity," he said. "We need recognition. We need to be treated like people who still have worth. We fought, we lost, we sacrificed, and the price we paid can't just be a medal handed out at a short ceremony." A piece of burning wood cracked in the fire, sending a burst of embers into the air, illuminating the worn, battle-scarred faces around it. Trump looked around, seeing not just veterans, but forgotten lives men who had once been strong, now reduced to shadows of who they used to be. Slowly he stood up. His gaze swept over each man one by one, not missing a single face. "The words you've spoken tonight will not be forgotten," he said, his voice carrying in the night. "I don't have an immediate answer, but I promise you this: I will not let these stories fade away. I will come back. And when I do, I want to see men like Jacob, like Grant, like Roger, all of you living the lives you deserve." Grant crossed his arms, studying Trump with a skeptical look. "You promise you'll come back?" Trump nodded without hesitation. "I promise." No one spoke after that. But in the way they looked at him, something had changed. Not trust. Not yet. But a flicker of hope. Like the fire still burning in the night. Suddenly, a man stood up, his eyes burning with rage. It was James Rourke, a veteran who had once fought in Iraq. The air around the fire grew heavy, the flickering flames casting restless shadows across the hardened faces of those who sat there. James Rourke clenched his fists, his bloodshot eyes filled with fury and perhaps something deeper, something broken. His tattered coat trembled slightly with each ragged breath. Once a soldier, once a warrior, he now felt like nothing more than a ghost in society. Trump did not look away. He did not flinch, did not show discomfort or irritation at Rourke's outburst. Instead, he took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute, cutting through the tension like steel. "You don't have to believe me," Trump said. "I don't blame you. I know you've been let down too many times to trust anyone, but I am not the kind of man who makes empty promises and walks away." Rourke took a deep breath, his gaze still sharp as a blade, locked onto Trump's face. He seemed about to say something, but then, without another word, turned and strode into the darkness, leaving his fellow veterans watching in silence. No one stopped him. Some understood. Some still doubted. Grant sighed as he watched him disappear. He's lost everything. His family, his friends, his faith. The only thing left in him is anger. Trump's gaze remained fixed in the direction Rourke had gone, his expression unreadable. Grant furrowed his brows slightly but said nothing. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled stack of papers. "This is a list of the men I know, men who served, who fought, but now live on the streets, forgotten." Trump took the papers, scanning the names. Each line was a life, a story, a man who had once been a soldier but was now discarded. The list was longer than he had expected. Then suddenly, a gunshot shattered the silence. Everyone jolted. Some of the veterans instinctively ducked, their bodies reacting before their minds could process the sound. Grant's hand moved swiftly to the small knife strapped to his side. Jacob clenched his metal prosthetic instinctively. But Trump didn't move. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, fixed on the source of the shot somewhere near the fence at the back of the shelter. A few seconds later, James Rourke stepped into view. But the gun wasn't aimed at anyone else. It was pointed at himself. "You talk about hope." Rourke let out a dry, hollow laugh. His voice was hoarse, trembling under the weight of emotions barely held back. "I tried hope. But when I came back, the world had already abandoned me. If I had died in Iraq, maybe it would have been easier. But no, I had to come back and see for myself that I had nothing left. That I was nothing." Jacob's face went pale. "Rourke, don't." Grant stepped forward, his voice urgent but steady. "You don't have to do this, Rourke. We fought together. You are a soldier. You are stronger than this." But Rourke shook his head, the gun trembling in his grasp. "I'm not a soldier anymore. I'm just a nobody. A statistic on a list of men no one cares about." Trump still said nothing. He didn't panic, didn't rush. He simply took a slow, deliberate step forward. "James." His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "If you were truly nobody, Then why do I remember your name? Rourke froze. His grip on the gun wavered. You feel abandoned. I understand that, Trump continued. But if you were truly invisible, if no one cared about you, I wouldn't be here, standing in front of you right now. Rourke swallowed hard. His eyes flickered, caught between despair and something else, something he had not felt in a long time. Trump extended his hand, not to grab the gun, not to force anything. Just a hand. A choice. You can give up right now, he said, or you can give me a chance to prove that I'm not like the others. The silence stretched. The cold wind bit at their skin. The fire crackled in the distance, like a clock ticking down. Then, slowly, Rourke's grip loosened. His breath came in ragged gasps. Tears welled in his eyes. He lowered the gun. Trump stepped forward, took the weapon, not snatching it, just accepting it, and placed a firm hand on Rourke's shoulder. You fought for this country, he said. Now it's time for this country to fight for you. Jacob exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing. Grant eased his stance. The others said nothing, but their eyes had changed. As dawn broke, the first light of morning stretched across the Texas sky, casting a soft glow over the shelter. Trump turned to Grant. He held up the crumpled list. This list, he said, will not sit on someone's desk. I will personally make sure that every single name on here is accounted for. Grant studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time that night, he nodded. Trump turned to his aide, his voice firm, unwavering. Get me the Secretary of Veterans Affairs first thing in the morning. We're not waiting another day. And as the convoy of SUVs rolled away, leaving the shelter behind, the veterans remained standing, watching the tail lights disappear into the distance. They did not wave. They did not cheer. But in their hearts, something had shifted. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but real, burned in the cold morning air. Maybe this time would be different. The next day, as the morning sun bathed America in golden light, the wheels of the system began to turn. An emergency executive order was issued, signed by President Donald Trump himself. There were no grand speeches, no empty rhetoric, only action. The Homeless Veterans Assistance Fund was doubled. Rehabilitation centers were improved, not just patched-up shelters, but real facilities where veterans could rebuild their lives. A nationwide employment program was launched, directly connecting veterans with businesses, ensuring that those who had sacrificed a part of their lives for their country would never be abandoned again. The changes began slowly, but then they spread. Jacob Hayes, the young man with the metal prosthetic arm, received a job at an electronics manufacturing plant. For the first time in years, he woke up not on a cold sidewalk beneath the awning of an abandoned building, but in a small, clean apartment. He stood before the mirror, staring at his reflection. He was no longer just a nameless figure on the streets, no longer a ghost of war. He was a person again, a man with purpose. William Grant, the aging colonel who had spent years drowning in the grief of losing his son, had found a new purpose. He was invited to join a National Veterans Advisory Committee, where he helped shape policies, connect forgotten soldiers with the resources they needed, and fight for those still left behind. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving. He was making a difference. James Rourke, the man who once stood on the edge of despair with a gun in his hand, was no longer a drifter lost in rage. With the help of a non-profit veterans organization, he entered intensive PTSD therapy and began rebuilding his life. More than that, he started helping younger veterans, men and women, who, like him, had once been lost in the darkness, believing there was no way out. He still carried his past, but he was learning how to move forward. No one forgot that night by the fire. The story of a president who showed up in the dead of night, sat among forgotten warriors, and listened without cameras, without fanfare, without a political agenda, spread like legend throughout the veteran community. People whispered about the leader who didn't just speak but acted. Not everyone liked Trump. But even his staunchest skeptics had to admit one thing. He kept his word. To word. 1 month later, inside the Oval Office, a handwritten letter sat on President Trump's desk. The return address, Texas. The handwriting was rough, slightly uneven, the mark of a man who had held a rifle far more often than a pen. Mr. President. You kept your promise. I've seen men who had lost all hope begin to believe again. I've seen Jacob stand tall on his own 2 feet, and I've watched Rourke learn to start over. And I have found myself again. But the work isn't finished. Now, I have a mission of my own. I will travel across this country, finding every forgotten soldier I can and bringing them home. Thank you, Mr. President, not just for what you did, but for listening. William Grant. Trump read the letter in silence. Something quiet but profound settled in his chest. He turned the letter over, then opened a wooden drawer beside his desk, a drawer where he kept the things that mattered most. Inside, next to the letter, sat a small, worn photograph. A young soldier, his uniform crisp, his smile bright, Lieutenant Daniel Grant. Trump gazed at the photo for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. In the quiet of the Oval Office, no one heard his words. But he whispered them anyway, a promise to himself. I will not forget. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, like and share to help spread the message that no hero should ever be forgotten. Every share brings awareness. Every voice makes a difference. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. It means a world to us. Together, let's honor the past, change the present, and build a future where no veteran is left behind.